If US and China go to war or losses, given their profound economic interdependence, extensive strategic modeling reveals that a direct military conflict between the United States and China would instantly shatter Togo's global supply chains and financial markets. This transforms the strategic calculus from a traditional contest for military dominance into a scenario of mutual economic destruction, making the very concept of a victor obsolete. A thorough analysis of the cascading consequences demonstrates that the ultimate loser would not be a single nation, but the interconnected global order that has sustained international stability and prosperity for generations. The strategic calculus governing a potential military conflict between the United States and China departs fundamentally from historical great power connotations, rendering traditional definitions of victory almost meaningless. Given the unprecedented depth of their economic integration, any direct engagement would immediately trigger a form of mutual assured economic destruction, a concept actual in numerous economic and military simulations conducted by policy institutes. The weaponization of this interdependence would be swift and devastating. For instance, a disruption to the flow of critical components like semiconductors or rare earth minerals, in which supply chains are deeply intertwined, would cripple advanced manufacturing and defense industries in both nations within weeks. Furthermore, financial warfare, including the potential seizure of freezing access to capital markets, would precipitate a global financial crisis far exceeding the scale of 2.8, according to many economic models. This immediate and catastrophic eco-immolation and self-hint that the conscious primary battlefield would be not only in the air and sea but also on stock exchanges and in corporate boardrooms, inflicting wounds from which recovery would take decades. The sheer human and material cost of a high-intensity conventional war would compound this economic collapse. Strategic analysis consistently projecting losses of high-value military assets, such as aircraft carriers and other jets, which are not easily replaceable and represent decades of national investment. The human toll for both combatants and potentially civilians in the densely populated Indo-Pacific region would be immense, creating profound societal trauma and demographic challenges. Consequently, the domestic political fabric of both nations would be stretched to its breaking point. In the United States, a protracted and bloody conflict could unleash social and political divisions that would mimic the turmoil of past wars pale in comparison, potentially undermining the very governing structures of the Republic. For China, where the Communist Party's legitimacy highly on a social contract of delivering stability and ever-increasing prosperity, the shock of a devastating war and a crippled economy could form an internal dissent and challenge its long-held grip on power. This strategic paradox, where the act of war itself guarantees outcomes that negate any possible military gain, means that even a nominal would emerge with its economy shattered, its population decimated, and its domestic political order critically destabilized, a victory name only, presiding over the ruins of its own power. Analysis consistently show that the weaponization of economic interdependence in US-China conflict would instantly cripple global supply chain financial systems for both belligerents. Beyond the immediate ruin inflicted upon the primary combatants, US-China war would unleash a systemic contagion, precipitating the collapse of the entire post-World War international order. The globalized economy, an intricate system built on the assumption of peaceful maritime transit and stable markets, would be the first casualty. Strategic analysis from various international shore bodies consistently warned that the closure of critical shipping lines in the Indo-Pacific, particularly the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca, would a vast percentage of global trade flows, would instantly halt supply chains. Maritime insurance risks would become prohibitive, effectively blockading global commerce and triggering hyperinflation for essential goods and catastrophic shortages for complex manufactured products. This immediate physical disruption would be matched by a financial catalyst, the weaponization of the US dollar-based financial system against Chinese entities, and retaliatory measures would freeze global capital flows and likely induce a liquidity crisis, dwarfing any previously experienced. However, the political fallout would be just as severe, confronting every other nation with an impossible strategic dilemma. US allies in the region, South Korea and the Philippines, would face immense pressure to become active participants, placing their economies and populations in the direct line of fire. European nations, where geographically distant, would see their economies decimated by the trade collapse and their security architecture destabilized as American focus and resources are irrevocably diverted from NATO. Neutral states and developing economies whose growth been predicated on access to both American and Chinese maritime investment would be forced to choose sides in a new Cold War. A choice that guarantees economic hardship and political vulnerability regardless of their alignment. Furthermore, the institutions designed to prevent or mitigate such disasters would be rendered completely inert. The United Nations Security Council would be paralyzed by the mutual veto, becoming a theater for acrimony rather than a tool for their escalation. Economic governance bodies like the World Trade Organization and the G20 would become irrelevant as their principles of free trade and cooperation abandoned in favor of autarkic war economies. This institutional breakdown would create a perilous power vacuum, where the norms against territorial aggression, so central to the international system, would erode, potentially inviting opportunistic conflicts in other regions as revisionist powers conclude that the era of superpower enforcement is over. The ultimate loser in this scenario is therefore not a country, but the very system of interconnectedness, international law, and collective security that has, for all its flaws, largely prevented great power war for over 70 years. A US-China conflict would shatter this framework, ushering in a protracted era of deglobalization, economic depression, and endemic regional instability that would profoundly mislead every nation on Earth. The most significant consequence of our US-China conflict would be the functional collapse of the globalized system, paralyzing international trade, finance, and the institutions designed to maintain world order. Ultimately, the strategic analysis of our US-China conflict reveals a stark truth: the question of who loses is answered not by naming a nation, but by pointing to the wreckage of the entire global system. The very interconnectedness that once promised shared prosperity becomes the primary mechanism for mutual ruin, confirming that in such a contest, the concept of victor obsolete. The only guaranteed outcome is a profound and lasting strategic defeat for every participant and bystander alike. If you find this level of strategic analysis essential, please consider supporting Survival Instinct to help us continue our work. Given the immense shared costs we've outlined, what non-military strategic frameworks so you will effectively manage it and they escalate great power competition in the 21st century? Thank you for engaging with this critical topic. Stay vigilant. Join us next time as we dissect the silent battlefield era current, the global fight for technological supremacy and control over the world's digital infrastructure.